The winter winds of the Northlands did not howl, they screamed. In the small, struggling village of Oakhaven, the cold was a living thing that seeped through the thickest furs and settled deep in the bones. But for Elara, the cold inside her father's longhouse was far worse than the storm raging outside. She stood by the hearth, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her father, Jarl Einar, did not look at her. He was busy polishing his drinking horn, refusing to meet the eyes of the daughter he was about to sell. "It is done, Elara," Einar said, his voice rough like gravel. "The alliance is sealed. You leave at dawn." Elara felt the air leave her lungs. She had known this day would come, but knowing did not make the blow any softer. "To whom, father?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain strong. "Which clan have you traded me to? The Wolf Eaters, the Iron-born." Einar finally looked up. There was no pity in his eyes, only the cold calculation of a man desperate to keep his starving village alive. "To the stone halls," he said. "To Lord Varic." The name hit Elara like a physical strike. Lord Varic. The stories about him were whispered by nursemaids to frighten children. They called him the Broken Wolf. Once, he had been a warrior of legendary skill, a man who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. But 5 years ago, during the Great Raid, he had been taken by enemies. They had not killed him. They had done something worse. They had taken his eyes with hot irons and left him to wander the frozen wastes. He had survived, miraculously, and reclaimed his seat as Jarl. But the whispers said he was a monster now. Bitter, useless, a man living in eternal darkness, guarded by a clan that pitied him. "Father," Elara whispered, horror rising in her throat. He is blind. They say he is a cripple. How can he protect me? How can he lead? You are sending me to a tomb. I am sending you to a wealthy hall." Einar slammed his fist onto the table. "Look around you, girl. Our grain stores are empty. Our cattle are dying. Varic offered 3 wagons of silver and enough grain to feed us for 2 winters. He needs a wife to bear him heirs before his ambitious cousins take his title. You need a home that isn't starving. It is a fair trade." 3 wagons of silver for her life. Elara turned away, tears stinging her eyes. She wanted to scream, to run into the storm and never return. But she looked at her younger sister, sleeping near the fire, thin and pale from hunger. If Elara refused, her family would starve. "Very well," she said, her voice hollow. "I will go, but do not expect me to forgive you." The journey to Varic's lands took 3 grueling days. Elara rode in a covered wagon, wrapped in furs, watching the landscape change from the familiar forests of her home to the jagged, imposing cliffs of the stone halls. The terrain here was unforgiving, sharp rocks jutting out of the snow like the teeth of some buried beast. When they finally arrived at Varic's stronghold, Elara's heart sank further. It was a fortress built of gray stone, perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking a frozen sea. It looked impenetrable, cold, and utterly joyless. The gates groaned open, and their wagon rolled into the courtyard. People stopped their work to watch. Elara felt their eyes on her. They didn't look at her with welcome or warmth. They looked at her with curiosity and something else. Pity. "Another lamb for the slaughter," she heard a stable boy whisper to a guard. "She's too pretty for him," the guard replied with a sneer. "What use does a blind man have for beauty? He can't even see what he's bought." Elara stepped down from the wagon, keeping her chin high. She was a Jarl's daughter. She would not let them see her fear. She was escorted into the great hall, a cavernous space filled with smoke and the smell of roasting meat. And there, at the high table, sat the man who now owned her future. He wore a tunic of dark wool and a cloak of black fur that made him look like a shadow made flesh. But it was his face that held her attention. It was a strong face, carved from granite, covered in a thick, dark beard. But across his eyes, a strip of dark leather was tied tightly. Below the leather, jagged scars ran down his cheeks, the brutal signature of the torture he had endured. He sat perfectly still, while the men around him drank and shouted. Varic was a statue. He didn't reach for food. He didn't speak. He just sat in the darkness, seemingly a prisoner in his own hall. The wedding ceremony was brief and cold. They stood before the village elder, hands bound together by a ritual cord. Varic's hand was massive, engulfing hers completely. His skin was rough, calloused from years of wielding a sword he could no longer see to use. He didn't squeeze her hand. He didn't lean in to whisper reassuring words. He simply stood there, breathing steadily, like a mountain enduring the wind. Then came the feast. This was supposed to be a celebration, but to Elara it felt like a wake. The noise of the hall was deafening. Laughter, clashing cups, raucous songs, but a bubble of silence surrounded the two of them. Elara looked at her new husband. He hadn't touched his mead. He hadn't turned his head toward her once. Was he repulsed by her? Or did he simply not care? The isolation was suffocating. To her right sat Varic's cousin, Torian. Unlike Varic, Torian was loud, handsome in a cruel way, and drunk. He leaned over, invading Elara's personal space, his breath smelling of stale ale. A sad sight, isn't it? Torian sneered, gesturing loosely at Varic. The mighty wolf reduced to a lapdog. It must be disappointing for you, my lady, to be wed to a man who will need you to cut his meat and guide him to the privy. Elara stiffened. He is your Jarl, she said coldly. Harsh barking sound. He is Jarl only because our laws pity the crippled, but strong clans need strong leaders, eyes that can see the enemy coming. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. If you ever tire of leading the blind, my lady, my chambers are warm, and I can appreciate beauty in the light. Elara recoiled, disgust churning in her stomach. She turned to look at Varic, hoping he would defend her, defend himself, but Varic remained motionless. Had he heard? The noise in the hall was loud. Perhaps he hadn't, or perhaps he had, and simply lacked the power to do anything about it. The thought made Elara's heart ache with a mix of pity and anger. She reached for her goblet of wine, desperate to wash away the taste of Torian's words. Her fingers curled around the metal stem. She lifted it to her lips, closing her eyes, wishing she was anywhere else. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the darkness. Varic's hand clamped around her wrist with the speed of a striking viper. The grip was iron, hard, freezing her movement instantly. Wine sloshed over the rim, staining the white tablecloth red like blood. Elara gasped, her eyes snapping open. She looked at Varic. He hadn't turned his head. He was still facing forward, the leather blindfold staring into nothingness. But his jaw was set tight, the muscles in his neck corded with tension. The entire high table went silent. Elara whispered, her voice trembling. You are hurting me. Varic didn't let go. He leaned in slowly, tilting his head just slightly toward her. When he spoke, his voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder, vibrating deep in her chest. Why, little bird? He whispered. Why? She breathed. Because, Varic said, his voice flat and terrifyingly calm. It smells of bitter almonds, and bitter almonds mean death. And this blind man, amidst the chaotic noise and smell of roasting meat and unwashed bodies, had smelled a single drop of poison in a cup he couldn't even see. Varic released her wrist slowly. He turned his face toward Torian. Even though his eyes were covered, Torian flinched as if a predator had just locked onto him. You are clumsy, cousin, Varic said, his voice carrying through the sudden silence of the hall. Next time you try to kill my bride, ensure the wind isn't blowing in my direction. The silence that followed Varic's accusation was heavier than the stones of the great hall. Torian laughed it off, calling it a drunkard's mistake, a jest gone wrong. But the look in his eyes was not one of humor. It was the cold, calculating stare of a viper that had missed its strike. The feast ended abruptly, the guests muttering as they shuffled out into the snow, leaving the blind lord and his pale bride alone in the flickering shadows. Servants escorted them to the bridal chambers. It was a large room at the top of the tower, cold and smelling of pine and old firs. When the heavy wooden door slammed shut, locking them in, Elara felt her heart hammer against her ribs. This was the moment she had dreaded most, the moment the beast would claim his prize. She backed away until her shoulders hit the rough stone wall, clutching her shawl tightly around herself. Varic stood in the center of the room, listening to the retreating footsteps of the servants. He didn't move toward her. He didn't begin to undress. He simply walked to the window, unlatched the shutters, and let the icy wind wash over his scarred face. "You are shaking." He reached up and untied the leather strip from his eyes, letting it fall to the floor. His eyelids were closed, sunken and scarred, a brutal reminder of the torture he had endured. "You are not cold, Elara," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "You are terrified. You think that because your father sold you, I intend to take what I bought." Elara couldn't speak. She could only stare at him, waiting. Varic moved then, but not toward the bed. He walked to the corner of the room, grabbed a pile of furs, and threw them onto the floor near the hearth. He sat down heavily, leaning his back against the stone chimney. "The bed is yours," he said, closing his eyes as if settling in for sleep. "I sleep better on the floor. Old habits from the years of wandering." Elara blinked, confused. "But the marriage bed, the heirs your cousin spoke of?" "There will be no heirs until you are willing," Varic said, his tone final. "I may be a cripple, little bird, but I am not a savage. You are safe in this room, safer here than anywhere else in this castle. Now sleep. Tomorrow will be a difficult day." Elara watched him for a long time, expecting a trick, but Varic's breathing soon evened out into the deep rhythm of sleep. Slowly, hesitantly, she climbed into the massive bed. It was warm, soft, and lonely. As she stared at the dark beams of the ceiling, she realized that the monster she had been sold to was perhaps the only man in the world who had ever offered her a choice. The next morning, Elara awoke to an empty room. Varic was gone. She dressed quickly and ventured out into the stronghold. The stone halls were grim by daylight. The stone was gray, the sky was gray, and the faces of the people were grayer still. She walked through the courtyard, watching the daily life of the clan. It didn't take long to see the truth of things. The soldiers didn't salute Varic's banner with pride. They slouched and gambled, their armor rusty. The servants whispered in corners, eyes darting nervously, and everywhere she went she saw Torian. Varic's cousin was striding through the yard, barking orders, inspecting weapons, laughing loudly with the men. He looked every inch the jarl. He wore fine red wool, a sharp sword at his hip, and walked with the confidence of a man who already owned the place. Elara found Varic sitting on a stone bench overlooking the sea. He was alone. No guards, no advisors, just a blind man listening to the crashing waves below. He looked incredibly solitary, a king in exile within his own kingdom. She approached him softly, but he stiffened before she was even 10 paces away. "Your step is light," he said without turning, "but you drag your left foot slightly, an old injury." Elara stopped, surprised. "I fell from a tree when I was a child. It hasn't pained me in years. How could you know?" "The stone carries vibrations," Varic said, tapping the bench, "and the wind carries the scent of lavender soap. You smell like summer, Elara. It is out of place in this frozen rock." Elara sat beside him, leaving a respectful distance. "I saw Torian in the courtyard," she said quietly. "He gives orders as if he is the jarl. The men look to him, not you." Varic's jaw tightened, the beard bristling. "Torian has eyes. Men follow what they can see. They see a warrior who can lead them into raids, who can spot a deer at 300 paces. When they look at me, they see a broken tool." "But you are not broken," Elara insisted, remembering the incident with the wine. "You sensed the poison. You heard me coming. You see more than they know." Varic turned his face toward the sea, the wind whipping his dark hair. "I see shadows. I see the intent in a man's voice, the hesitation in his step, but I cannot see the sword swing until the air moves. I cannot see the map to plan the raid. I am a wolf with no teeth, Elara, and in the north such wolves are usually put down by the pack." "Then why are you still alive?" she asked boldly. Varic smiled then, a grim, humorless twisting of his lips. "Because they are afraid. They remember the man I was before the darkness took me, and they are not quite sure if that man is truly gone. Torian tests me little by little, like a dog nipping at the heels of an old bear. He waits for me to stumble. Once I fall, he will tear my throat out." Not at Varic, but for him. "I sit here and wait for the end." Varic corrected. "The waves tell me a storm is coming. Not a storm of snow, Elara, a storm of blood." "And when it breaks, I will need to be ready." Days turned into weeks. A strange routine settled between them. By day, Varic endured the subtle humiliations of his clan, Torian interrupting him in council, the servants forgetting to fill his cup, the whispers growing louder. He took it all with a stone-faced patience that maddened Elara. But by night, in the privacy of their chamber, the walls came down. They sat by the fire, and he taught her. He taught her how to listen to the castle settling, how to tell which guard was walking the hall by the jingling of his belt. In return, Elara gave him back his sight. She described the world to him. She told him the color of the sunset over the frozen bay, like spilled wine on snow, she said. She described the faces of his men, telling him who looked away in shame and who sneered with ambition. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, Elara sat on the rug, mending a tunic. Varic was whittling a piece of wood, his knife moving with terrifying speed and precision, guided only by touch. "Torian stopped the grain shipment to my father's village," Elara said suddenly, her voice tight. "I heard the steward talking. He said the blind lord needs no allies." Varic's hand stopped. The knife hovered over the wood. "He breaks the treaty. He dares to," Elara said, "because he thinks you will do nothing, because he thinks you are weak." Varic stood up slowly. The piece of wood fell to the floor. It was a perfectly carved wolf. He walked to the fire, the flames casting long, dancing shadows across his scarred face. "He mistakes patience for weakness," Varic said, his voice dropping to that dangerous rumble. "He thinks I am blind to his ambition." "But he forgets, Elara. Darkness is not empty. It is where the monsters hide." He turned to her, and for the first time, Elara saw not a broken man, but a warrior coiled to strike. "Tomorrow," Varic said, "I go to the training circle, and you will be my eyes." The next morning, the air in the training yard was sharp and cold. Soldiers gathered in a circle, their breath misting in the air, watching as Torian sparred with two men at once. He moved with arrogant grace, disarming one and knocking the other into the mud, laughing as the crowd cheered. "Is there no one else?" Torian shouted, spinning his blade. "Is there no one in the stone halls worthy of testing my steel?" "I will test it." A deep voice cut through the cheers. The crowd parted. Varic stepped into the circle. He wore no armor, only his dark tunic and trousers. In his hand, he held a heavy practice sword. Elara stood at the edge of the ring, her heart in her throat. She had guided him to the entrance, but now he was alone. Torian turned, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You, cousin, you wish to play at war. Be careful, the ground is uneven. I would hate for you to trip and break your other leg." "Draw your sword, Torian," Varic said calmly. He didn't raise his weapon. He stood perfectly still, his head cocked slightly to the side, listening. The soldier snickered. A blind man in a duel. It was madness. It was suicide. Torian chuckled. "Oh, very well. I will be gentle." He lunged forward, a simple, lazy strike aimed at Varric's shoulder, intended to humiliate rather than harm. Varic didn't see the blade, but he heard the crunch of snow under Torian's boot. He heard the whistle of steel cutting the air. In a blur of motion, Varic sidestepped. He brought his own wooden blade down, not on Torian's sword, but on his wrist. The crack was loud. "You are noisy, cousin," Varic said, turning his head to follow Torian's movement. "You drag your feet like a cow." Torian's face flushed red with rage. He snatched up his sword with his other hand. "You got lucky, cripple," he roared. He charged again, this time with real fury. He swung wild and hard, intent on taking Varric's head off. Elara covered her mouth to scream, but the sound died in her throat. Varic didn't retreat. He moved into the attack. He ducked under the first swing, parried the second by the sound of the metal clashing, and then, with a roar, he drove his shoulder into Torian's chest. Torian flew backward, landing hard in the mud. Before he could rise, Varic was there. The tip of his heavy wooden sword pressed against Torian's throat. "Yield!" Varic growled. Torian stared up at the blind man, his eyes wide with shock and fear. The soldiers whispered nervously. The myth of the broken wolf had just been shattered. The wolf had teeth. "I yield," Torian spat, humiliated. Varic withdrew his sword. "Remember this lesson," he said to the silent crowd. "Sight can be deceived, but pain is always true." Elara ran to him as he left the circle, taking his arm. She felt him trembling, not from fear, but from the adrenaline. "You were magnificent," she whispered. "I have embarrassed him," Varic said, his voice grim. "He will not wait for the storm now, Elara. He will bring the lightning tonight." Night fell heavy and dark over the fortress. Elara and Varic retired to their chamber, but neither slept. Varic paced the room, extinguishing every candle, every torch, until the room was pitch black. He pulled the heavy curtains shut, blocking out even the moonlight. "Stay behind the bed," Varic ordered, his voice barely a breath. "Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." "Varic," Elara whispered, reaching for him in the dark. "Hush, they are here." At first, Elara heard nothing. Then, the faintest scratch at the door latch, the lock clicked, the door creaked open just an inch. 3 shadows slipped into the room. They moved silently, blades drawn, creeping toward the bed where they expected a sleeping blind man and his wife. They were professional killers, hired by a humiliated cousin. They expected an easy kill. But they had made a fatal error. They had entered a room of absolute darkness, and darkness was Varric's kingdom. The first assassin reached the bed and raised his dagger. From the corner of the room, a sword sang through the air. There was a sickening thud, and the first man collapsed without a cry. The other 2 spun around, swinging their weapons blindly, panic setting in. "Where is he?" one hissed. "Here." Varric's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Varic moved like a ghost. He didn't need to see them. He smelled the oil on their leather armor. He heard the rapid thumping of their hearts. He tracked the displacement of the air as they moved. He struck the second man, the force of the blow sending him crashing into the table. The third man swung wild, his sword sparking against the stone wall. Varic caught his arm, twisted it until the bone snapped, and silenced him with a single punch. Silence returned to the room. Elara crouched behind the bed, trembling. "Varic," she called out into the void. "Light the candle, Elara." His deep voice replied. It was calm, composed. With shaking hands, she struck the flint and lit the bedside candle. The small flame flickered to life, illuminating the scene. 3 men lay unconscious or groaning on the floor. Varic stood in the center of the carnage, his chest heaving, his sword lowered. He turned his scarred face toward the light. "It is done," he said. The doors burst open. Guards rushed in, torches blazing, led by the captain of the guard. They stopped, staring at the defeated assassins, then at their blind Jarl standing victorious. Behind them, Torian appeared, his face pale. He had come to inspect the corpses. Instead, he found his executioner. "Arrest him," Varic commanded, pointing his sword at his cousin, "for treason against your Jarl." This time, the guards did not hesitate. They had seen the training circle. They saw the assassins. The broken wolf was gone. Varic sheathed his sword. He looked tired, the adrenaline fading, leaving him weary. He felt for the edge of the bed and sat down. Elara crossed the room. She didn't look at the bodies. She looked only at him. She knelt before him, taking his large, blood-stained hands in hers. "You saved us," she whispered. "I protected what is mine," Varic murmured. He turned his head, sensing her nearness. "I told you, Elara, I am a monster in the dark," Elara said firmly. She reached up, cupping his face, her thumbs tracing the jagged scars beneath the leather blindfold he had forgotten to wear. "You are not a monster. You are a king, and you will never be in the dark again." She leaned in and kissed him. It was a soft, tentative press of lips, but it sealed a bond stronger than any political alliance. Varic froze for a moment, then, with a low groan, he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, burying his face in her neck. Years later, the legends of the North would speak of the blind lord of the stone halls. They would tell tales of a warrior who needed no eyes to see the truth in men's hearts. They would speak of his justice, his strength, and the golden lady who stood always at his side, his eyes and his heart. But in the quiet of their chambers, Varic knew the truth. He hadn't just survived the darkness. He had found the one soul bright enough to banish it forever.